gardening and growing food, you realize, wow, and it's this like sort of ancestral knowledge that we all carry, and it taps into this place in your soul, I think.
Marie-Pierre Bilodeau can definitely testify to the power of gardening. Marie-Pierre is the founder of ReFarmers, a grassroots organization that creates and supports small-scale community-based food growing initiatives and land-based learning opportunities. ReFarmers has projects in Canada, Kenya, and Uganda. Marie-Pierre will speak to a few of ReFarmers' urban farming initiatives with regards to the Vancouver Urban Food Forest Foundation that she helped found, and Tiny Space Gardens. This episode explores alternative urban farming methods for those who want to start gardening but maybe don't feel like they have enough space, enough time, or enough money. You will hear the insights of Marie-Pierre in the first half of this episode, and then the insights of Brenda Dick, an avid guerrilla gardener, in the second half of this episode. They will both shed light on the power of small-scale urban gardening and the ways gardening can be made more accessible to urban dwellers and personalized for those with disabilities. Welcome to Growing Together, a podcast that covers a range of topics on food, food security, and disability. I am Maya Nelson-Roundtree, your host, and this podcast is brought to you by the Disabled Independent Gardeners Association. Before starting, we would like to acknowledge that we are calling in today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I hope you enjoy today's episode of Growing Together. So can you tell us a bit about yourself and your inspiration behind starting ReFarmers?
Yeah, I've been working internationally for many years, and was really interested in food justice when I started urban gardening here in Vancouver, and realized that it really can grow more than just food, and it really grows community as well. So I realized that food could be a connector. And so ReFarmers was called East Africa Permaculture Project. Originally, we were working, I took my permaculture course on Salt Spring Island, and the course continuation was in East Africa, where I continued to work for the next couple of years with my teacher, Brandon Bauer.
And have you always been interested in agriculture?
No, actually not at all. And that's why people who think that it's too late to start, or it's, you can start at any age. I think I was like 35 when I only had houseplants before. I think I wasn't patient enough when I was younger, maybe too. Like I was moving a lot, traveling a lot. So you kind of have to, you could cultivate patience, though you can cultivate a lot of life skills in the garden as well.
Yeah, so I know that you also helped light the spark to what is now the Vancouver Urban Food Forest Foundation, which has yet to be launched. But how would you describe a food forest and the Vancouver Urban Food Forest Foundation?
The Indigenous nations here have been stewarding food forests since time immemorial. It was actually proven by not that we need to prove it, but through oral history we've known this, but an SFU, Simon Fraser University, new study showed that folks actually from thousands of years ago were stewarding land and pruning and transplanting to form food forests. So the food forests have been around for a long time, but it's not just permaculture, but that's where I first learned about it, and so anyway, a food forest mimics a natural forest landscape with perennial fruit trees and a lot of especially native shrubs and different layers. There's 7 layers usually, and then we also want to have a collective or annual garden bed as well. So it'll be, food forests are designed depending on your landscape. It depends on where it's located. There's all kinds of different ones, but it's basically lots of fruit trees and perennials, lots of plants that you don't have to replant. And that's for soil health is important because, it holds the soil in place, it prevents erosion. There's just so many benefits to having perennials, but we do want to have an annual garden bed too that's collective as opposed to this allotment model. So the volunteers would all share the produce and learn together and so it's a bit of a different, with a sharing ideology, and people have to sort of change maybe their views of what gardening is to them. And, cultivating this interdependence that is lacking in our communities, I think, where we don't even know our neighbors' names sometimes. And I think the pandemic showed that this is a very important aspect to healthy communities, is like, who are your neighbors and how can we be in each other's lives?
Yeah, and in what ways is the Vancouver Urban Food Forest Foundation going to be accessible for people with disabilities?
We really want to design the space with the communities. We want to represent our neighborhood, and we want the folks to be, in the garden with us. And that might take time. It might not start off looking like what it will be in 5 or 10 years especially with folks with disabilities. We're really interested to have folks come to the space and let us know how to make it accessible, other than what's already, like the pathways that are already in the park that access the space. But with the beds, and also involving, like I said, with our collaborators, organizations that are already working with, like DIGA, gardening folks, gardening with disabilities, because, that's not my expertise, but there's already lots of amazing people doing that. So how can we collaborate with them to make this space suitable for everybody? That's really what we'd like to do.
So I'm aware that Reformers is also promoting tiny space gardens like sack gardens that can be used by those with not a lot of gardening space, but also those who want to grow their own fresh produce. Can you tell me more about this initiative?
Burlap sack gardens, which is something I learned in Kampala and Nairobi, actually, in the slums there, where people have really limited space to grow food. And so they use rice sacks. And it was just such an inspiring thing to see so much food growing it's a vertical gardening technique. So you don't just grow out of the top of the sack, you cut holes all along the sides. And so you can't even see the sack eventually when everything's growing. Here we have access to free burlap sacks from all our coffee places. If you go to any coffee roaster in Vancouver, pretty much they're free. So teaching people skills that they could bring back to their balconies or windowsills. And we do recycled pop bottle garden towers. And so there's ways that people don't realize that they can address their own food insecurity, but I guess I like to say nutrition security better, because it's hard to address your entire food security because we can't grow like staple foods, usually like wheat and enough of those things, but we can address our own nutrition security easily with growing, lots of greens and herbs and even carrots in containers. And there's just so much you can do.
Yeah, I looked into the sack garden and tiny space gardens on Reformer's website, and it really seems like such a creative initiative. I've seen pictures of gardens made from tires and recycled water bottles, and even a hat and a pair of pants. So can you tell me why sack gardens and small space food growing is especially useful for urban spaces?
Yeah, I think it's really important for urban biodiversity. It's crazy. I have this rosemary plant in my balcony in a small container, and in the winter or late winter, the rosemary was flowering, and a hummingbird came to feed on this minuscule purple flowers, and I was shocked. And so I was just so amazed, and to be connected to nature like that, seeing that little hummingbird, and those moments seem so insignificant, I guess, when you just talk about it, but when they're happening, it really just gives you shivers, and it just shows that you're really connected. And it's so important for us to get out of our bubbles of whatever we're going through in our lives and be connected in that way. And so providing smaller urban gardens can provide great expanses for all these, bees, and which we need for pollinating all the food that we eat to create like fruits and certain veggies. So really small gardens can have a very big impact on the local wildlife, even if it doesn't seem like it. They really do.
So can just about anyone make a sack garden? In what ways can it be personalized to be more accessible to those with disabilities?
Yeah, I guess it depends. First of all, they're pretty heavy, and you need to make the sack where you're going to keep it. So maybe the sack's are not always the best to start with, because it is kind of a big garden. I realize after giving multiple workshops this year that depending on the level of gardening that people, the skill level, but actually if you're determined and motivated, it doesn't, if you want or willing to learn, then it's definitely accessible to anybody, any skill level. It's just, it requires a bit more diligence, I think, if you're a very new gardener. So starting smaller than even a burlap sack would maybe be better for folks with disabilities, like the pop bottle gardens, or even just, you can grow a lot in just pots, and people don't really, you can even grow in a, kind of medium-sized pot. You can even grow potatoes in them, and as long as they're deep enough. So pillowcases. You could grow potatoes easily on a balcony. I guess it could make a bit of a mess. Just really, you have to adapt those to you have to get creative and not be afraid to experiment and make mistakes too. So, but starting small is always definitely the best way to go, because you can be encouraged by your successes. So the pop bottle gardens are really great. We have online tutorials as well on our various websites, and and then if anybody ever has questions, they can email me as well, and I love to coach people on this kind of stuff.
So I do have one final question. How can people listening right now support or get involved with ReFarmers?
Well, you can always financially support us, which we always welcome. And our current, you can read about all our current projects and everything we're working on at refarmers.org. And VUF, we are actually just working on our website right now. You can sign up for our mailing list. So VUF is VUFFF, so 3Fs.org. So it's, VUF.org. And right now you can just sign up on our mailing list, but you can also access our Facebook page and stuff through there. So refarmers.org and VUF. Oh, and also, got so many initiatives. Tiny-gardens.org we just launched this website, which we're working on adding more resources, but there at the moment you can find our burlap sack garden tutorials and a few other ways to share stories. And so that's it.
Marie-Pierre just spoke to ReFarmers' urban farming initiatives that are here to help urban dwellers reconnect with nature and to each other. Brenda Dick, an avid guerrilla gardener with almost 40 years of gardening experience, is on a similar mission to help people improve their communities through gardening, specifically guerrilla gardening.
It's not just about large spaces, but having a community come together and grow stuff together is a huge, huge thing.
Brenda is constantly looking to uplift communities through gardening, whether that's through her TED Talk, workshops, her website, Guerrilla Gardening Adventures, or seed giveaways. Brenda considers it her personal mission to convince urban dwellers of the benefits to gardening, even if that means breaking a few rules. So can you tell me what exactly guerrilla gardening is and how you became a guerrilla gardener?
Well, guerrilla gardening is the act of gardening without permission on land that does not belong to you. So it seems a little radical, but I'm going to kind of explain how it all came about. So I've always been the kind of gardener. When I lived in a house, I always kind of, encroached on the neighbors' yards, and they were fine with it because, it made their yards look nice and it was all good. But when I downsized to a townhouse without a yard, there was no place to really plant things. So I started planting stuff in containers along the front walkway. Well, I got a letter stating that there was excessive number of pots on my driveway, which there was. I had 45. So, I don't think that's excessive, but apparently some people do. And so I just looked in the rules, and I didn't actually see a rule where it said how many pots you could have. And then I ran across this quote on the internet, and it said that gardening is the most therapeutic and defined act you'll ever do. And you get strawberries. And I'm thinking, okay, I get how it's therapeutic, but I don't really get how it's defiant. And it was attributed to this guy named Ron Finley. And he's from East LA, and he started planting on the green space between the sidewalk and his house. And it actually belongs to the city. So he planted some tomatoes and some sunflowers and some other vegetables, and people in the community helped themselves. Now, this was really great, but the city didn't think it was so great because there was actually laws against planting on that property, on city property. So they tried to fine him for gardening without a permit, and his community backed him. So he ended up winning and then promoting this whole guerrilla gardening thing. And there's a lot of other famous guerrilla gardeners out there too. And he calls himself the gangster gardener. And I'm like, guerrilla gardening, like, so I started reading up on it, and I'm like, oh, and I'm started looking around, like there's all these, like there's the common area at my strata, which there's actually rules about. But I thought, well, I'm going to plant an apple tree and see what happens. And nothing really happened. And I make apple pie jam and I give it to everybody in my strata. So your people in your strata can be bought off with jam and produce. And same thing with all the pots. You know, we had someone new on council and I got the letter, but I never ended up with a fine because people just told them, well, you know, it's Brenda. She's like the guerrilla gardener and you'll get some tomatoes, so just ignore it. So that's how it all kind of started.
I see. So, given that you said guerrilla gardening is a form of defiance, but also given that so many people support and pursue guerrilla gardening, there must be something to it. So, why do you feel this form of defiance is important?
Well, I think it's important because I think there's more and more people living in high density housing, whether it be an apartment or a condo. And so many of those places do not have green spaces at all. And I mean, it's great to have parks and things like that, but food security, especially in the last year and a half, has really been brought up to the forefront. And the amount of produce, I don't know about where you live, but where I live, the amount of produce that you buy in the stores right now is really subpar. It's half rotten by the time you buy it, and it's really expensive. The farmland is at a premium, and community gardens, like my town has, I believe, 2 community gardens, public ones, and they are full. Their wait lists are years long. And so I think that has to be brought more into more cities, because people really need nutritious, accessible food, and it's really not happening. And community gardens, there just isn't enough of them to go around. So sometimes I feel that people just have to take it upon themselves. And if that means breaking a few laws, then so be it. You know, I'm not telling anyone to do this unless they want to provide bail money, because some people are pretty strict about this. But I'm just saying it is an option, and there are a lot of people doing this. This is a worldwide movement.
And speaking of that, do you think guerrilla gardening is for everyone?
I do. I think that there's more and more people that are in spaces where they don't have a garden or they don't have room to grow. And ideally, it would be great if you could convince the cities or your strata to be on board with it. That would be the ideal situation. But sometimes it's a bureaucracy of red tape and rules. People with disabilities, you know, you have issues with mobility, but it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy a garden. The community garden that I belong to, we have private plots which belong to people. We have plots for different organizations with people who are disabled. We've started putting in wheelchair accessible paths. So even if you're disabled, if you can fire off an email to your city council for community gardens or allotments, or you team up, maybe, you know, you have mobility issues, but the other person is capable, maybe their hands work better than yours. You know, if you can team up with a team of people to even grow like one tomato plant in a container, you can get self-watering containers. There's master gardeners. They have to in order to get their certification, they have to volunteer certain hours. So these are people that could help in bringing this together. There's different groups out there that could definitely help gardening. And gardening, I think, is for everybody. Like, I've got arthritis really bad in my knees, and eventually I'm going to need knee replacements and things, but I still plan on gardening for as long as I can. And there's going to be a point where maybe I am in an apartment and I'm not going to have room, but I can still be involved with guerrilla gardening. So it's such a good thing to be involved in, however that may be. You know, maybe it's not the physical part, maybe it's the promoting it, maybe it's having a group, you know, forming that sense of community. That's huge. And you always end up with more produce than you'll ever use. Like, it's zucchini season right now. I'm picking like 4 or 5 zucchinis every day, like every day. And luckily, I think it's August 8th is Leave a Zucchini on Your Porch Day, on your neighbor's porch day. So my neighbors will probably be getting some zucchinis.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of different ways to get involved with guerrilla gardening, and I love the leave a zucchini on your neighborhood's porch day. It should definitely be a national holiday. So it seems like guerrilla gardening could be such a great movement, especially for neighbors or neighborhoods that do not really have access to fresh produce or green spaces. What do you think guerrilla gardening's full potential is in feeding communities with regards to food access and food security?
I think that if you could get enough green space, like even where I live in my strata, there is some common areas. And during our first lockdown, like at the beginning of, you know, a year and a half ago, when we were locked down, everyone was off work in my complex. You know, there was nothing to do because you couldn't go anywhere. Everything was closed. And even when you went to the stores, sometimes the shelves were empty. So one of the things that I do is I always collect heirloom seeds. So, and I always have a ton of them. So I shared them. Everyone in my complex, and there's 40 units, everybody got tomato seeds and they got flower seeds. So people started building planters and they started planting stuff. And one, it was something for them to do during the pandemic when they didn't really know what to do. And two, people started growing stuff. Now, this year, again, I gave everybody seeds, but people have expanded on that. So, like, where people were not so much into producing fresh food, when they found out what they could produce in such a small amount of space, they decided to continue with it again this year. So it's not just about large spaces, but having a community come together and grow stuff together is a huge, huge thing, you know, and not just the more space that you have. If it's just that little space that's in front of your house, I mean, you want to make sure that the city isn't spraying pesticides or things like that. And you don't want to plant anything that's invasive. But if you even just grow a tomato plant or even just some flowers to improve your neighborhood, it's plants or make people happy. So if you can improve upon that, that's great. But I think it has great potential to produce a lot of food in a very small space. And some people, like being a gardener, I have fresh vegetables all summer. And last fall, when I went to buy tomatoes, and a tomato cost $3 or a pepper cost $3, like I told my husband, I just grew $10,000 worth of produce last year, I swear. And I don't have a yard. I have a community garden plot and I have these 45 containers in front of my house. But I not only have enough for me, I have put some in the freezer and I have enough to give my neighbors as well. So if I can do that with such a small space, the potential is so much larger for all these unused spaces that happen to be around most cities.
So for those listening right now who may not have a lot of space to garden, or just those interested in guerrilla gardening, how exactly can they get involved with guerrilla gardening?
Well, one of the things is I have a website. It's guerrillagardenadventures.com, and that's spelled GUERRILLA, like guerrilla warfare. So it's guerrillagardenadventures.com, and there's a whole thing on, you know, questions and facts about guerrilla gardening, a little bit more about it if people want to learn more about it. And there's also different organizations. So definitely use Google, find people, if there's people in your local neighborhood or in your community that you can join up with. If not, maybe start your own. If it seems like too radical an idea to be breaking laws and stuff like that, or you can't afford the bail money, there might be other things you can do too. Like, start contacting your city about incorporating more community gardens into your green spaces. Food is a human right. And so however you achieve that, if it's by breaking a few rules, as long as you clean up and make it tidy and share in the produce, I think that's an important thing.
Brenda just spoke to the joys and power of guerrilla gardening. Previously, Marie-Pierre spoke to ReFarmers' urban farming initiatives. They both shed light on the ways small-scale urban gardening can be made accessible for those with disabilities, and the ways it can have such powerful impacts on your community and provide greater access to fresh produce. Thank you for listening. This podcast was kindly supported by Ingenium, Canada's Museums of Science and Innovation. Stay tuned for more episodes of Growing Together.